The 2021 Toyota Supra. This has to be one of the most polarizing modern sports cars currently on sale, and this is a vehicle Mark and I have covered since its launch in 2019. So in this video, we're going to be taking a less technical and more philosophical approach. We're going to talk about what the Supra means for the GR brand as a whole, talk about how it stacks up against vehicles like the C8 Corvette, a car that was supposed to make this thing irrelevant, and how this compares to other Lexus or Toyota products like the all-new GR86 or LC500. So enjoy. Before we head into the shop, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the Toyota Supra's cabin. And the very first thing you're going to notice when you get into this is how much different it feels than any other Toyota or Lexus product. And yes, a lot of that has to do with the fact that this has BMW switchgear and BMW iDrive, but it's also because the design language in this cabin is so much different than something like an LC500, which is Lexus's flagship. It lacks any of the interesting geometry found in the door card or door panel design. The dash layout is relatively simplistic, and this is a very functional, somewhat drab cabin. And that is not particularly Japanesey feeling from a practicality perspective or usability. You have a quiet cabin, but it is a usable place. If you are below 5'10" or 5'11", you should be fine in this cabin. While it doesn't offer a ton of headroom, if you are within the window of height accessibility for this car, it's a nice place to be in. It's comfortable, it's quiet. There is some storage found in this cabin, like the door cards and the center armrest, and you have a very, very usable trunk. When it comes to the electronics front, this is all prior generation BMW stuff, which means it works. It's probably actually the best infotainment system found in any Toyota or Lexus product. BMW iDrive is excellent. This prior generation iDrive still has wireless Apple CarPlay. It's easy to use and has a good mix of touch and rotary physical controls, which is excellent. So with that said, let's head into the shop and talk about what the Supra is and is not with Mark.
Why did you drag me under another Supra, Jack?
Well, it's been a little while, and now we've driven all the cars that are supposed to make this thing relevant. We've driven the new GR86, we've driven the C8 Corvette, which is apparently God's car that you can somehow buy for $60,000.
Which doesn't exist.
Nope. And you can also buy the 718, which this car was developmentally benched against. They bought Caymans to figure out how they wanted the dynamics of the Supra to be. So I thought it was a good time to drive this car once again and see if our opinions have changed at all.
Before we get into that, we need to talk about two things. One is the incessant marketing, negative marketing from social media, from normal people complaining this is not a real Supra. And you even see videos with Akio Toyota talking about the importance of this car because it links to their history of the previous vehicle. And I, for one, as time has passed, realize more this is definitely not the Toyota that we kind of hoped for. It doesn't have that Toyota feel. It's far more BMW. It's far more Euro, more German. That doesn't mean it's a bad thing. But I said at the start of the GR86 video, people didn't push back on that car as much because it had no connection really to history. When you slap a moniker like Supra or any brand that reuses a badge like this and then doesn't fulfill their own.
Like think of the Mustang EV.
Right.
Among enthusiasts, people hate that thing because it's a CUV electric car.
Yeah.
And this, in truth, is very BMW. While the dynamics and the final finishing pieces of the development process were Toyota, were the engineers that you know and love from the Toyota GR brand, they're the reason this car drives the way it does. But you can't get away from the feeling that it feels like a BMW, whether it be the interior, the way the rear end feels, or how the engine
feels,
sounds.
the transmission tuning, all of that stuff. And Toyota has explained this to us in great detail, or to me, and I've asked this question. They said this is the only way it would exist in this economy, in this age. And then the counter argument is Toyota is one of the biggest companies in the or car companies in the world. You're telling me they couldn't afford to build a dedicated sports car. And I think the finances, the economy of sports cars. These don't sell in high volume. The return is not there. People break them. It costs more to warranty repair. But if you're Akio Toyota and you want to put your own brand, GR is his project, his baby from way back then. Why would you want to put essentially the first 2 GR monikers on a car that you didn't build yourself? Maybe that's like his mindset is working with partners and all that, but that hasn't been explained quite well, at least from Toyota America. We don't have a good explanation as to why they continue to do this and use other companies. So
it's a B58, which Toyota kind of helped them with some of the R&D with when it came to reliability. It's an inline 6. It makes way more than advertised power. It really makes probably over 400 horsepower with the crank. It's connected to an 8-speed ZF, which you know and love. It's in every manufacturer. The shifts are very fast, but unlike some of the other cars with the ZF 8-speed, it will upset the car when you're mid-corner, which adds to some of the fun. It's strut front, multi-link rear, and then you have a BMW-style M-like rear differential. Our rear diff in this car may not be working correctly based upon our experience on the track, because it only seems to be locking one wheel, which gives it some weird characteristics, but in a traditional BMW or M car, it's a very interesting diff. It allows you to do huge power slides when you get to a certain lock point, like we did in the M3 and M4.
After driving this more, especially on our track, the rear end is definitely more weird than I originally thought. And I think some of it's driving it, or some of it's playing around with things more normal people don't, like upshifting, downshifting at weird points that you normally wouldn't, to see what the car is doing and feeling it out. And I feel like this is, and I said this before we got on the track, I know this was intentional. There's no way all their test engineers and chassis engineers from either BMW and Toyota would go out there and be like, okay, we want the rear end to kind of be like doing strange stuff. They would have been able to sort this out. So I think it was intentional to give it some character, to not make it perfect, to make you work the car more. So, I mean, I don't know. You may like that, you may not, but it's definitely not as easy to drive fast as something like the C8 or the Cayman. That those cars feel a little bit more like they're doing more for you than this. This feels more edgy, and I wouldn't say edgy in a great way.
It's less natural than something like your LC500 because you have a traditional Torsen differential. Again, this car could not be working correctly. It is a press car, but a Torsen in like the IS500 or your LC feels very progressive.
Yeah, there's the window of operation of control is much larger on certain cars like that. The window for control it's basically going and you have to correct, and it's real snappy. Yeah. So you have to stay ahead of this car a little bit more, which is again partly why people like drivers' cars. It's a little bit more complicated. It's a little bit more twitchy and hard to drive fast. And I think that's, what is this car? Is it a driver's car or is it a GT car? I guess that's where I'm confused with it.
It's got an identity crisis, but I think with that, Mark, it's a good time to take this out on the track.
All right. The track, Autobahn Country Club in the Supra. Never had this out here before, so it's a little bit different than what I expected, I'll be honest. What's your thoughts?
This is an interesting car. I mean, this thing's been out for a couple years now. It is not particularly beloved by people on the internet, for right or for wrong, and it's in a very competitive segment. We spent time in the car. It was developedly benched against the 718. We spent time in the C8, a car that everyone claims makes this vehicle irrelevant. And with the 400Z coming out with a manual, I think the Supra is in a very precarious situation with enthusiasts. But when you get it out here on the track, unlike some of the other cars it competes against, specifically the C8, it feels alive.
Yeah, I would say that's the main thing. What really annoys me right now is that mid-range frequency from the fake engine noise is really grating on my nerves. And I know it's so you can hear the engine or whatever the approximation of the engine is when you drive it, but it's so annoying. And luckily you can code it out. But I would say, other than that, the main things that I picked up on, and it's the same for me as when I first drove this, it's more edgy, right? It's edgy in a way that makes it more engaging to drive. You have to chase the back end around a little bit more. and it's not to the point where it's snapping, but you have to work more to keep this thing going straight, which makes it feel like more of a driver's car. And I mentioned this to you before we started filming this today. This was obviously a conscious decision to do what they did to the back end on this car. So you could, obviously, with suspension and tires, make this back end way more stable, way more balanced. As it is, it's pogoing around a little bit, but that's also part of its charm to make it feel like you're enjoying it, like you're having to work and being more connected with this overall than some of the other competitors.
It's a really good driving tool. I think it's a very rewarding car to drive hard too, which it's funny, I know we talked about this in our street drive. Most of the time this car is kind of boring on the street. You get the fake pops and cracks and it wants to go sideways all the time, but most of the time you don't know that there's a good car underneath all of this. But
yeah.
When you're driving hard, you really feel it. How's the engine and the gearbox, Mark?
They're great, honestly. I mean, the gearbox is everything you could want from a torque converted automatic, and of course the engine is remarkably powerful. And we kind of joked around. We put this against the LC500 in a straight line, and this mops that up. And there's a lot of cars that this would mop up. And I think, to me, this has such a high starting point. Like, they've started at such a high place for 50,000, and that's really all I'm gonna bring up about this, and the rest you're gonna carry us through and kind of your finer points. But this would be a much bigger problem for me if this was a lot more money. If we're talking about a $70,000 sports car, I'd be tearing it apart for having a rear end that pogos around, that's not as balanced. It should be more neutral, all the things that you would expect from a really well-developed rear-wheel drive sports car. But they're giving you a great starting point. You could still get into this at the mid-level. My question is, now with the Z, with a twin-turbo 400 horsepower car with a manual transmission out of the box, you know, I think this is basically going to put Toyota and BMW against the wall, and they're going to have to figure out how to fast-track the manual and release it to compete. Otherwise, there's absolutely no point of getting this other than just, you know, you're kind of a BMW Toyota fan. You want an automatic that's really good.
Yeah, my worry about the 400Z, and I'm going to bring this up before we get into the final thoughts, is that the 400Z is based on a platform that is nearly 2 decades old, and it could be amazing, but if it's like the older car, which, to be honest, I wasn't the biggest fan of, it's more Mustang Camaro versus this, where this feels, again, because it was dynamically benched against the Cayman, feels like all of your inputs deliver a more immediate reaction.
Right.
It's not muddled, it's very direct, in what you do immediately causes the car to do something, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I noticed that I'm just not even following the line right now as we're talking. And, you know, the 300Z, you know, or 350Z or 370Z, sorry, I get my numbers mixed up. You know, that car out of the factory, the inputs were very dumbed down, right? There was a lot of slop in the car. You basically had to do suspension to get it to turn in instantaneously. Like you said, it was more of a muscle car mentality and less of a driver's car, and you had to do a lot to get it there. This car already feels more of a driver's car out of the box, so the amount of work you're gonna have to do to it in the aftermarket to kind of get it to where you need it is gonna be far less than the 370. I'm almost positive they're gonna take the 400 and it's just gonna be that formula amped up, where it's drift sideways everywhere and, you know, a little bit more numb inputs, but I could be wrong. But that's going to be the key difference between these two cars in my mind.
Yeah, so with that, Mark, I think with that important point out of the way, I think it's time for us to head into the final thoughts.
All right.
There's some golf clubs banging around back there, Mark.
Final thoughts on the Toyota Supra. And yes, this is another video. Jack scheduled it to do somewhat of a comparison between this car and the 718 Porsche, which they claimed that this was benchmarked against. So I kind of have a different feeling with this takeaway from the past videos. So I'm gonna go over some of that. Just to put it bluntly, at 50 grand, if this is what you're getting it for, it's a budget M car. It feels like an older M car. You're getting so much performance here for that dollar amount. It is insanely quick in a straight line. And I put it next to the LC500 just to see how much faster it is. Just a straight launch. it's like 4 or 5 car lengths. I mean, it's really, really quick. And of course, it's not a true Toyota product. We know that. There's some DNA here, but I think that's the biggest downfall of resurrecting the Supra badge is this does not feel like a Toyota product. And I think that's what most Toyota people don't like about it. So we already know that. We beat that to death. So now driving it again, there's a few things I will say from the dynamics perspective. And yes, you can't have everything for 50 grand. I understand that. But with the new Z car coming out, with the new 86, there's more kind of sports cars coming out. So for me, when I drive this, my biggest issue is the rear end. And this is not, it's pretty much a lot of BMWs that are rear wheel drive. You get in a steady state corner, you're kind of like quarter or half throttle, you're cornering and snap. Back end just starts to walk. And it's so disconcerting and it makes the car feel way more unbalanced. And I don't know if it's a rear differential tuning problem, if it's the way that they have the suspension set up, but it gets really, really annoying to me because it's not a progressive thing, it's a snap, and it does it a lot. It's like the equivalent of hitting a wet patch on the pavement, and it did it on the track, it did it on the street, and I know you could dial this out probably with a better alignment and super sticky tires, but it's something I feel like they need to work on. The second thing is transmission tuning, and again, the more I've driven it, the more it's annoyed me. You're in a steady state corner again, or a slight corner, you're going from first to second in sport mode, or a larger radius corner in going to second or third, that trans will snap and it'll create this driveline shock that'll unsettle the back end too. And I know it adds some character to it, but it also is a little bit unnecessary. It makes it just, you're constantly have your guard up driving this car. And in one case, if you like that edgy driving experience, you're gonna love it. If you don't, and you need that more relaxed driving experience, you're going to hate it. But really, we know what this car needs. It needs a little bit more refinement. It needs a manual transmission, not just on the 4-popper model, and that's a rumor that's happening. They need a manual on both the 6-cylinder and the 4-cylinder to make this a bit more competitive, along with just a little bit of evolution of the suspension, and I think it's an amazing value for what it is. That's where I'm gonna leave it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.